Good afternoon, good evening. Today, I'm hoping to be in conversation with Indira and some of you about eco-spirituality and trafficking and looking at the implications that this has for our social work practice with diverse victims and survivors. My name is Ajwang. My other colleague who was supposed to be presenting with me, Cinderella, is unfortunately not here today. So I'll be presenting on our behalf. And I just want to start by appreciating all of us today. And this is in terms of just being open to thinking about our strengths, our talents, but also being appreciative of the different spaces that we currently are in or we're joining from, but also thinking about the courage, kindness, and creativity that we bring into these spaces, which also sustain us. I'll be looking at kind of like understanding the spiritual, religious needs of victims of trafficking and how to create those safe environments, but also what are the implications of the eco-spirituality when working with diverse victims of trafficking. There could be certain triggers based on what I'm going to share. And the sharing this evening, this afternoon, is based on the work that I've done in the past more than 10 years with victims of trafficking within the Southern African context or the African context. If you're triggered by anything, I'm happy for us to kind of like debrief after this as well. But before we carry on, my two takeaway messages are victims and survivors of trafficking present with many wounds, physical, emotional, psychological, and now we're also starting to see a lot of environment-related wounding or symptoms. And this is what they would share with you as a social worker if you when they come to see you. But also important to think about the contemporary spiritual practices, which include community development work and vice versa, which is community development work, kind of like looking into spiritual practices, because a change in both is about the internal and the external world, irrespective of how you look at it. I'll be using the terminology victim and survivor interchangeably. But it's important to understand that in using the terminology victim, this is because of the legality of that terminology, but also taking into account the harm which has been caused to that person. But it does not refer to how the person may feel or perceive themselves. It's basically just the events that happened in their lives. And it's also not intended to label the person. And I always take the cue from when I'm working with survivors, whether to call them victims, survivors, or warriors. And that is what I usually use for the rest of our conversation. So what is trafficking in persons? Trafficking in persons, there needs to be an action, a means, and a purpose. But in cases of children, you don't have to have the means, so long as you can show that the young person or the child was being taken away from a place, or the end goal of them being in the company of somebody else was for them to be exploited, that can still be taken to be trafficking. However, when it comes to adults, the action, the means, and the purpose has to be there for it to qualify as trafficking. And people are trafficked for different reasons. For harvesting of their organs, for drug trafficking, for domestic labor, for labor bondage, for sexual exploitation. So it's a variety of reasons, but it could also be multiple reasons in one person. The trafficking cycle, the typical trafficking cycle looks at the recruitment of the pre-departure, the travel, the destination, arrival, reception and detention, and sometimes the rescue and rehabilitation or reintegration back into either their community of origin or another community, which is a lot more safer for them. Classical trafficking involves travel, but one can be recruited and exploited in the same space where they've been recruited within almost like the same time period. So travel doesn't necessarily have to be a part of the identifiers. It is a process, it's not a single act, and it's important to understand that, especially with regards to also ecotourism and the kind of interventions that we hope to put into place. When it comes to trafficking statistics, this has been referred to as a statistical nightmare because we actually don't know the scope of trafficking, how many victims are out there, how many traffickers are out there, who is going to be trafficked next, how they're going to be trafficked, where they're going to be trafficked to. So it kind of like all remains a mystery every single day. And that is what makes trafficking a lot more challenging to tackle as well. So when it comes to trafficking and eco-spirituality, lots of studies have looked at elements of spiritual coping, eco-social work, but very few social workers are starting to look at the notion of eco-spiritual practices with victims and survivors of trafficking. Though some of the work that they have been doing could actually lend itself to this, and I'll share that on one of my last slides. The psychosocial outcomes of victims depend on access to appropriate services, but not only appropriate services, but also timely services that addresses their biological, physical, behavioral, cognitive, emotional, social, spiritual, and environmental needs. There's a shift within social work where we're starting to see the connections between social challenges and also environmental challenges, which wasn't happening in the past. In the past, we talk about the person in environment, but there wouldn't be that connection, even though we're talking about the pie. Part of this work that I'm presenting today is a follow-up to a previous paper that I published with a colleague where we looked at guidelines for social work spiritual counseling in human trafficking cases. Ecospirituality can contribute to that understanding and the interventions very specific to trauma and other needs of the victims or the survivors, but also the depth of identification with themselves and or in relation to the environment. This topic also ties to the IFSW principles that people should take responsibility for each other and the environment, and we need to respect the interdependence among people and the environments where they inhabit. Based on my engagement, my interaction with victims of trafficking, what I've seen are those inaccurate beliefs or those distorted beliefs in a higher being, whatever a higher being might mean for you. Talking about how God has been uncaring, why should I have to go through this? There are elements of distorted view of the self. There could be these elements of disorientation and being disconnected with themselves, disconnections with their religious or spiritual affiliations. There's a distortion with the view of others, not being able to trust, tending to think that most people are actually out to exploit them, because human trafficking is actually a relational trauma. So it's also important to think about that. And part of the victims not trusting others could also be seen as that invisible wall where they're trying to protect them. A lot of trafficking victims are actually trafficked and exploited by people that they actually know or they knew. There are profound disconnections, but also with some victims and survivors, we've also seen those connections as opposed to disconnections. So it's important for us to also just give recognition to that. And I'm just gonna close there. And one of the victims indicated that they go to church and is all this to help other people. Maybe once I get there, then they also make reference to the Quran. It was also quite interesting that one of the other victims that I interviewed, the pseudonym that they chose, stands for the prayerful one. So quite interesting to see how that also came about in or during the interviews, where on one hand, she was taking drugs in the trafficking situation, but equally at the same time, she was praying. And eventually she also says that she believes it's prayer that got her out of those situations. This is one in social work, is that we need to think about inclusion in post-trafficking pathways of care. And pathways of care starts from, it's a continuum of care from the time that the victim is actually identified all through to the time when they're actually reintegrated or resettled into the different communities. And it also calls for us to think about how we do the biopsychosocial assessments. How do we incorporate elements of the environment, of nature into those assessments? Would we be asking about the quality of air, the quality of water, what kind of environmental injustices exist currently where you are, existed where you are held in bondage, pre-existed before you were even trafficked? I think this becomes important. Then eco-spirituality is a precondition for social development. So when we're thinking about social development, it's important for us to think about sustainable living and kind of like growth based on those interconnectedness. And it's about the self, the others, and the nature, and not on the individualistic elements that we tend to think about, especially when we're working with victims of trafficking from a clinical perspective. Then there's the notion of what has been referred to as a spirituality of resistance, which taps into social work activism. So how can we think about this beyond the anti-oppressive practices and other structural work that social workers have been doing within activism? Whenever I do my interviews with the victims, I'm quite observant about their environments. So it could be a shelter situation, it could be where they come and get the therapy, if it's not incorporated within the shelter or the facility where they're staying. And some of the things that I noticed, which links to eco-spirituality, and that is why I said social workers are already doing this, but perhaps they're just not aware of it, could be the gardens that they have in the shelter. It could be the outdoor facilities that they have. In one of the shelters, I refer to it as a blue gym because it was quite close to the ocean. And a lot of times they used to take walks there. When I looked at the social worker's office, it was a green kind of like counseling space, which is actually quite therapeutic as well. A lot of communities, for example, in South Africa, there's a concept of the outdoor gym. So most of the victims and survivors also used to go there. They used to take walks. They were actually encouraged to take walks as many times as they wanted in a day, so long as it was also secure. So thinking about this healing environments when we're practicing with the victims is important. Then I think finally, it's also thinking about Ubuntu-informed eco-spirituality. And this is informed by the work that I did in Africa. I am because you are, and showing that interconnectedness with the relationships around us, but it's not only about those relationships around us, but it's also with the environment. An interesting concept that hasn't really been researched a lot. So there's been spiritual or religious coercion when victims of trafficking are being recruited, but we also haven't really thought about the elements of witchcraft, or what is sometimes referred to as African medicine, where from a spiritual realm, one could actually harm the other person. And some of this has also been coming up when I speak to the victims and how scared they are of certain interventions or certain things that a social worker needs to do with them to kind of like break the curse or the break what has been placed upon by somebody else, kind of like that realm of witchcraft. And finally, in doing this work, it's important to think about the self versus the collective self-care. And I would advocate more for the collective care because it really speaks to some of the things that we could do together in terms of doing yoga together. It could be I've taken lots of walks with some of my colleagues just to be able to debrief and to talk about some of the difficult cases that we've encountered. So it's quite a range of things that we could think about from a collective space, as opposed to thinking just about yourself in terms of self-care. And with that, I would like to say thank you for listening to my presentation today.